Welcome back to the third year of Tideline's Compass series, and thank you for joining us. I'm Ben Thornley, Managing Partner at Tideline, and with this webinar, my colleagues and I are pleased to introduce a new Compass series initiative called Currents. Tideline's intention with Currents is to spotlight the trends and strategies propelling impact investing forward, including the tools of climate impact management, which will be featured in today's session in partnership with our good friends at Rho Impact and Prime Coalition. All of our Currents webinars and blog posts will be available on the Compass series page on Tideline's website, which we'll put in the chat in just a moment. Please follow along with Currents for masterclasses, timely interviews, and commentary focused on accelerating impact as we deepen Tideline's commitment to institutionalizing best practices. It's my pleasure now to introduce our MC for today's inaugural Currents event, Claudia Leon, a Senior Associate at Tideline and our Climate Practice Lead.
Thanks, Ben. Really eager for today's session. So as Ben mentioned, for our inaugural Currents event, we'll be diving into emerging approaches for estimating the emissions reductions from new and emerging climate technologies. And the reason why we're so excited to have this session is because in the last year or so, we've increasingly been working with investors who are pursuing exciting technologies, projects, and solutions that promise to help bend the curve toward a net zero world. And often the benefits from these solutions are focused primarily on their ability to reduce emissions in the future, and often through an indirect manner, such as replacing more intensive processes or enabling the transition toward cleaner solutions. And so now we're seeing investors think about how to assess the benefits from those climate technologies prior to making an investment, or at the very least, developing the capacity to measure and report that impact to their stakeholders. So to talk about the best practices that are evolving in this field and emerging approaches to emissions reduction analysis, we're thrilled to be joined by Keri Browder and Seth Sheldon from Prime Coalition and Rho Impact, respectively, who have been leading the charge on a lot of this work. So again, Keri joins us from the Prime Coalition, where she serves as the director of Project Frame. And her focus there is on creating a network for investors to share tools and best practices that help drive solutions to reduce GHG emissions. And Seth is a founder and the chief scientific officer at Rho Impact, an organization that focuses on ESG and net zero strategies and solutions. And Seth was also, which he'll be talking about today, a key contributor to the development of the methodology for the Crane tool, which builds off of a lot of the great practices that Project Frame has been working on. So just to kick it off today, Keri, I might turn it over to you to tell us a bit more about Project Frame, its history, and your involvement in the work.
Yes, thank you, Claudia, Ben, Tideline, and everyone here today. It's a pleasure to be here. First, I'm going to sort of start off with a little bit of background on Prime Coalition, where I work, and what led us to convene Project Frame and help launch the Crane tool. Prime Coalition is a nonprofit organization that works with the philanthropists and other mission-oriented organizations and individuals to support sustainable, effective, and scalable solutions to climate change. We are an investor ourselves, and so a lot of people sort of don't understand the full picture of all the things that we work on. But I think this graphic sort of helps understand that we have different programs. One is through direct catalytic investing. We only invest in companies that we think have the highest potential for gigaton scale climate benefits. Impact accountability, which is the program that I run, of which we have both Project Frame and Crane, and then learning and leadership, where we focus on building what we're now calling catalytic courses, so we can spread this knowledge as fast as possible and help others come along this climate journey with us. And next slide, please. This is just a little bit of our work to date as far as the capital raised towards direct catalytic investment. We're really proud of the over 3,000 users we have for the Crane tool. And then recently, we just collected data on just the venture capital and the private equity members of Project Frame, and their assets under management is over 200 billion for climate. And so we really think that we can hopefully accelerate the best solutions and best minds possible to really curb what we're seeing in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Next slide, please. I already touched on this, but these are different programs. We're primarily going to be focused today on what we call impact accountability. So we have two pillars of that, one being Project Frame and the other being the tool Crane. Next slide, please. And Project Frame is a nonprofit program that is convened by Prime Coalition. But as Claudia was saying, we wanted to build a group of investors who are focused on pre-seed and Series A investments and help them come up with the similar terminology and best practices to hold ourselves accountable to the impact that we want to see. At this point in time, we have 600 individual members globally, 120 venture capital and private equity investors. And together we have raised about 60 billion that is intended for climate. So our goal is to make sure that we drive those resources towards the best possible and scalable solutions. All right, next slide, please. To give you a little bit of a background on what led us to build the Frame methodology and follow on with the Crane tool, I thought I'd go over a paper that we wrote previously that was released. We'll share the links in the chat, but on the impact methodology landscape. And I know as an intro course today, we want to get into the details of doing the analysis, but just so people have an understanding, once we looked at the methodology landscape, we found that it was mostly focused on other methodologies were focused mostly on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. It is a very difficult landscape to navigate with a lot of different words and terminology. So it was difficult to compare not only one investment to another, but another portfolio to another. And it was difficult for investors across different offices to speak the same language when deciding whether or not to co-invest for climate impact. And then good data and tools are essential, as we'll get into more. What you get out is what you put in. And so how can we join forces to make sure that we're generating and sharing quality data that helps all of our investments, companies, and aspirations succeed if we're going to meet the climate crisis? And this continues to be a really evolving space. Even in my time with Prime Coalition, we've gone back and forth on how we express the methodology, on developing our glossary, which I'll share in the chat later, and just making sure that it's easier for us to communicate in order to stop pitfalls that we come up against, both at the pre-investment and post-investment phase. Next slide, please. So this is sort of an idea of all the different methodologies that were assessed. And one thing that is important to highlight is that there is a much larger array of opportunities or methodologies that look at footprinting versus what we call impact. And then we go into what is potential and planned impact. And Seth will talk about that in more detail. That we decided that this was sort of the niche area that we really needed to get into, was not necessarily retrospective footprinting, but how can we assess investments today and try to get a better idea of how they could potentially succeed at reducing GHG emissions in the future as an indicator or a guide point as to whether or not we should decide between one investment and another. Next slide, please. And so once we realized that was the problem, and we had worked with NYSERDA to develop a paper on early or emissions reduction potential, we realized that there was a gap in the market for a tool to help those navigate different types of investments. And it goes beyond just investors themselves, but a lot of entrepreneurs would like to better understand what their potential impact could be. So after we developed the methodology, had launched Frame, and we're working on building the community, Prime Coalition realized there was a need to build a software tool, and luckily was able to find funding to help launch what is now the Crane tool. Next slide, please. So this is the report that we did. If people are really interested in getting into the details, I'll be happy to share that in the chat. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through everything about the report itself, and we will leave that to Seth to give some guidance. But next slide, please. All right, so what is Crane? Crane is a one-of-a-kind open source web-based application that allows users to use a lot of the applications that we have tried to develop through that report and Project Frame to understand the potential impact of an investment. It's just the first version. We are hoping as we see the methodology and the community evolve to create a Crane 2.0 and to run through different user applications with you all in the future. But for this first course within Currents, we're really focused on the basics and the fundamentals of emissions reduction potential. And hopefully that will provide everyone with a baseline for which they can then sort of upskill to using the Crane tool in the future. We do have a user report from 2021, and it's worth mentioning this started in 2019. So all of this has happened in a really short period of time. We're still learning, and we hope that this is just the beginning in really accelerating our investments in the best possible climate solutions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Seth, who is going to give us a primer on emissions reduction potential. Thank you, Seth.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Keri, and thanks, Claudia. So I'm, as others mentioned, I'm Seth Sheldon, the Chief Scientific Officer at Rho Impact. I've been thrilled to, well, first of all, thrilled to be here and excited for, seeing so many familiar names and attendees. It's the last point from a few slides ago about it being a rapidly evolving space is like the understatement of the decade. It's been amazing, the work that we've all been able to do in the last year or so, last few years, to kind of push the envelope. One of the phrases that we sometimes use is raise the floor of the quality of the analyses that are being put into practice today. And I'm preaching to the choir that these are such important decisions we're making constantly. We really want to see the quality of the analytics going into the decisions improved across the board, and start being able to talk to each other more seamlessly, use similar terminology, understand the principles behind it. So that's one of the reasons I think for if we want to start off in the slide deck with paper 2, an introduction to assessing planned greenhouse. Thank you. As Keri was saying, Crane has been this excellent tool that we used and implemented a ton of, tens of hundreds at this point of emissions reduction potential analyses. And it came out in 2020, and it was based on quite a lot of work, not just on the software development side, but also on the design side, pre-design side, and then specs side, the technical specifications that we developed with an academic advisory group and a user group, and that was back in 2019. And in 2020, early 2020, we debuted Crane beyond the beta test, and it's been cranking along ever since. But in the meantime, or in parallel, Project Frame got started in earnest, named, and all of the key founding members of that, and then all of the working group members started to join, and we've made just a huge amount of progress. I say we pretty liberally. It's really all of the other members of the team, and especially Prime Coalition and all the great leadership that Keri and her team have been providing. So that's really been the cornerstone of, I would say it's really the beating heart of this work, and where the best place to look for the terminology, guidance, resources, all of that. It's a great network, and so that's where we want to kind of linger today. So that was just by way of an introduction. If you were coming and hoping to get into the weeds on Crane, there's plenty of time to do that. I'm happy. Email me anytime, seth.sheldon@rhoimpact.com. We're always happy to dig around in the software. Improvements are coming in 2023, so that we kind of catch up to where Project Frame is. But for the remainder of the presentation, at least for my component, I'm hoping to hit some of the fundamentals and lessons learned from 2021, 2022. Next slide, please. Yeah, so starting just with a few principles, they're takeaways, they're principles for us, and kind of lessons learned. We've taken these really to heart, and this has come from a lot of discussions, people applying their own methods in potential and planned impact, a distinction which I can make in a few minutes, as well as ERPs, and it goes by a lot of different names: avoided emissions, future avoided emissions. There are so many ways of assessing impact. Some are better than others in terms of transparency and quality analysis, depth, rigor, usability, reusability, and the details truly do matter. So just documenting the research step, just documenting the process and assumptions and references and all of that is, it's full-time. It's a full-time job that we've offloaded a lot of that to Crane, really with the intention of making putting to best use the analyst's time and the managers' times and the decision makers' time, so that we're not dealing so much with the research component. And the very last thing we want from any forward-looking or planned analysis or potential analysis, planned impact analysis, is for it to be put in a freezer, or to get dusty, to kind of mix my metaphors here. To do it, have it be a box that you check, a convoluted and complicated and resource intensive box nonetheless, and then never look at it again. That's the opposite of what we're trying to inspire here. They're living models, and there's so much that is so many learnings from everyone involved, and there are multiple stakeholders, multiple audiences, multiple experts, so many different views coming into the impact story, whether it's on the environmental science side, the financial side, pure investment side, the sort of visionary technical and technological disruption side. So many voices that need to be captured and inform these models, and that really means that the assumptions, third point there, they have to be clearly articulated. So it's as much about the progress, it's as much about the process as it is about the final ERP number. If anything, the process is all important. And in order to make it as valuable as possible, transparency is truly essential, and transparency in the way that, like, practical transparency. So that's certainly a takeaway, which is, everybody says it, and I think that Project Frame and elements of the Crane tool are really doing it. But there's so much work left to do to make it useful. And then having conservative models, coming from a position of the greatest critique, so that any model is really more about how you can quickly interrogate the model, break it down so that you can build it back up. That's really the point. It's not about trusting that the model is right because the set of eggheads said it was right. It's about going in and looking and seeing where you can contribute to it, and figuring out which variables or which parameters, which assumptions are moving the needle with respect to the results, which are then going to inform your investment decisions. So that's really critical, and we've heard that from everybody, and from the investors, from the startups, various stages of startups, that's really key because our time is limited, and these types of models can get impossibly complex. And we truly don't have the time or resources for that, so we have to battle that. And then to that very point, these are living models. We'll use examples. We have examples in this presentation. A few examples, and there are many more that we're always happy to kind of walk through. And we have to keep testing. I mean, we're all learning as we're going. We have to keep improving it, and Project Frame is a great space for that. And then all of us involved in the space are welcome contributors to the conversation. So that was by way of a thank you for everybody attending as well. Next slide, please.
Seth, just quickly before we move on from here,
Sure.
We do have a question in the chat around just what lessons have been learned perhaps about building off of existing GHG emissions taxonomies, and if there are any ways to kind of use the work that's been done to identify high potential investments. Just how you're thinking through that in the key takeaways that you've already learned about using taxonomies and the existing work in the industry.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Keri, did you have a comment?
Oh yeah, I can jump in on that one. I think I find the word taxonomy a little bit challenging versus like the language that we developed in the glossary versus the protocol that other offices use for screening companies. One thing that I think is important, what I've seen be successful in some of the members we have in Project Frame, is that it's important to first come up with a vision for if you're deciding that you want to focus more specifically on climate, on what it is that you want to achieve. And then why these analyses are helpful is it's best if you create something that's time bound and quantitative. So in the instance of Project Frame, when we screen our companies, the ones that we end up investing in directly, we believe have the ability to abate a gigaton of GHG emissions by 2050. Whereas others use different units or different timescales, but like we stick to that as a principle for our screening. I also think it's really important for investors to be open to different types of blended finance models. In some case, if you're building a portfolio and you're purely finance focused, you know that some companies provide higher rates of returns than others. I think that's the same when engaging with climate. So sort of look for who you think can really deliver measurable, scalable GHG impact, along with those that we call more enabling, that allow some of these different types of companies or solutions to be successful. And then I also think it's really necessary that we start investing more heavily in the most needed spaces. So areas include methane, biodiversity loss, aerosols, where there aren't that many companies out there. We need to find and encourage more of them, but that's where we're going to have the biggest impact.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's such a good question. From the technical and kind of implementation side, when I hear taxonomy, it was a good call out, Keri. I think of either terminology we're using, our own taxonomies that we're developing, as well as just resources generally that we're, the sort of the shoulders of the giants who precede us, GHG protocol. Crazy amount of work that WRI has done in this space, and there too many to list, as well as all the work in the EU taxonomy and guidance for individual sectors and everything. I would say that from a implementation standpoint, having a structured conversation and a standard method of reducing these set of impact questions to essentially the mechanics or the physics of these systems, and then relating that to the market demand, the units of market demand, which we'll talk about here in a second, can be really clarifying. So in 100%, I would say, 100% of the cases when we've gone in, Rho Impact, the sort of consultancy, and reviewed the ERP style analyses that have already taken place. There's 100% of the time, there are materials that were put together that inform this style of analysis. An example would be an LCA that may have been done, right? A life cycle assessment that may have been done, or other market research and market projection information, or you name it. There are always elements, and so we seek to build on those kind of collectively, and we'd be crazy not to. So I think that's good question. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm gonna run through. It looks like a few of our dots shifted a little bit. That's bound to happen with conversions. Anyway, I'm just gonna run through the major points, the key steps in setting up. The first time that you're doing this, the kind of coming to an ERP in the most basic terms. There are lots of different ways of, I don't know, peeling an orange. But we're going to go through the sort of 101. Crane, just a quick reference to Crane. It is different in some elements, but the underlying data, assumptions, and everything, they do align. It's consistent in theory. It's just a question of like which door you want to go into and tackling the space. And we found, the working group members of Project Frame, that this has been the fastest way to kind of communicate the basics. The unit impact approach is a really strong. It's the right foot to start on. So that's just we'll kind of leave that behind. Step one. It seems maybe trivial, but we've gone around and around with plenty of startups where they have a really technical. They're very excited about their technologies and the potential for them, and there may even be a business case that they're just that is itself an innovation. But we'll sort of force them to patiently, as well as the investors, force them to patiently take the time to articulate in as clear terms as possible why the innovation is better than the alternative or the incumbent technologies. It's a question of impact type. You can look at energy efficiency. There are all these different ways you can describe the impact through categorization and everything. We like to say at the very beginning, how does it work? What does it do? And if it works, will it matter? So these are all questions that you can start to kind of grapple with the basics of the approach, because everything else is going to stem from that. If you can't articulate this and how it works and why it's going to be better than the alternative, why it'll be better for the climate or any of the other areas of environmental or social impact, then it's worth pausing, because it's going to just get more convoluted from there. So that's the first question. How's it driving? What's it expected to avoid, and how? What are the system boundaries? You have to explain timelines, and we talk about time frames later on. How big is the system? This is taken almost verbatim from the life cycle analysis and life cycle assessment field, where when you're describing these larger interconnected systems and you're trying to understand where and how impacts are occurring and what the sort of embodied impacts might be for an individual technology and or activity or interventions, you have to be clear about what the boundaries are for your system. Start simply saying, say, just the US, or just a specific, maybe it's just a locality, maybe it's the whole globe, because that happens to be the data that you have available, but be sure to define that. And you have to articulate it so that you can do better intercomparisons later on. Think about attribution. Have the discussion around attribution. It may just be a component. Your innovation or what you're investing in may just be an innovation that is part of a wider system. It often is. Well, it always is. But it's just a question of how embedded that is and how far from, say, a consumer it is. Timeframes I already discussed. And then if there are multiple ways that you're seeing the technology have a positive influence, or negative, given the downsides and risks of burden shifting to other environmental metrics, articulate those. Always better to start from the baseline, say, I'm only going to look at this one pathway, and then assume that the other benefits are going to be additive. But the worst thing to do is to start off with a vague or poorly articulated impact hypothesis for the technology itself that cobbles together too many things at once. Yeah. So, and that's consistent with the sort of principle of conservatism in these analyses. Be the best critic when you're trying to understand how the positive elements are going to be, and then you'll figure out where the potential downside risks are. Next slide, please. Okay, this is where it gets a little bit more mathy, starts to get, but I promise this is arithmetic. At this level, you have to define a unit of innovation, and you need to define the incumbent unit, and these things need to be fungible, or at least the incumbent unit, what the market unit of demand is, or whatever unit you've decided to look at and to use in your model, has to be replaceable by the unit of innovation. It's not always easy with that. Sometimes it's easy. We have a couple of softball examples here: heat pumps, electric vehicles. You can get your hands around those, but it's not. This is deceptively simple for certain technology types, and it also relates to baselines. I don't know, Claudia, if you had any questions around that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm seeing here on the slide the distinction here kind of in the types of units of innovation. So can you just speak a bit more to how you're thinking through this for, say, a hardware solution versus a software solution that might have more of an enabling effect than a hardware solution might?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's stay in the domain, whether it's overused or not, of electric vehicles. Easiest case would be saying, well, what's the unit of innovation for an electric vehicle in terms of this your impact analysis? Is it the individual vehicle? Are you a manufacturer of vehicles, or is it a component within the vehicle? Are you going to be measuring based on the number of vehicles that you've enabled, or the number of, say, new motors that you're going to be putting into these vehicles and on the road? Is that your functional unit? Again, to borrow a little bit from the life cycle literature, or is it vehicle miles traveled? Or if you're in transportation, you're looking at shipping. Is it something more specific to that industry, like kilometers traveled? There are the world and all these industries are awash in really good conventional units. These kinds of physical questions have been thought about before in ways of measuring. So I always look there. But it also depends on what you have access to, what additional data conversions you want to do. If you're selling the motors, maybe it doesn't make sense to do the additional math to try to get to vehicle miles traveled. No matter what, whether you're adding new motors, and this is true for software as well, maybe the system is just better AI for on-road travel. And your theory, ultimately, and I say this often, a software improvement, or maybe a activity improvement, or a new policy, it doesn't matter, whatever the innovation is, must be reducible somehow. The dots have to be, you have to be able to connect the dots between your innovation or your technology and a change in atmospheric CO2 concentrations. If there is no path there, and the change in atmospheric CO2 concentrations, or just start with carbon footprint or expected future carbon footprint, if there's no clear path there, then you should question whether or not there's this is a truly additional kind of technology. The good news in all of that is we've never come across in the climate space, we've never come across a technology that is started out in the climate space that may be software that didn't have some connection, some plot, like reasonable connection to it that would be convincing to all of the stakeholders involved. That's kind of by design. So it's always possible to reduce those kind of software interventions or software interventions and others into a physical change. It's just sometimes the data transformations get a little bit more complex, or you have data, different data and calculation constraints, I would say. Hopefully that answers your question. Excellent. Next slide, please. Okay, once you've defined your unit, the next step is to say, what are the emissions associated with a single unit? This is part and parcel with defining the GHG intensity. I don't even think we describe it as GHG intensity on this slide or in some of the project frame materials, but these are the same thing. When you have a life cycle, whatever you've decided within the bounds of your analysis need to be in, whether it's the emissions that went into constructing the device or operational emissions in the point of use, or maybe end of life emissions, whatever those things may be, you have to capture those, articulate them, and then reduce it to an individual unit. That could be time bound, which you'll see in the example, the worked kind of notional example that we have for a sort of unit technology. And so you can consider how it would change, like where the emissions or savings are coming from year to year, or where the emissions are coming from in absolute terms. But the critical piece here that I would just point you to is that it's the absolute impact of the unit of innovation that you want to be looking at. Ignore all of the noise of what you're going to be displacing. Don't try to skip ahead to figuring out net impact yet. That will come. The first thing to say is, if you have a new technology, when your technology is being used or is in place, what are the emissions of that new technology? Likewise, likewise, you need to do the same thing with the status quo. The good news is there's lots of data on the status quo, whether it's the projections, or if you're just looking at an individual unit atemporally. Maybe I want to displace an individual ICE vehicle. There's a lot of good info out there on that. That absolute view of the emissions for these two things will come in handy later on if you go to the next slide, to calculating the unit impact, where you're just subtracting one from the other. You've done all of the work to define and to create a rational comparison between two things that are, at least from a market demand standpoint, interchangeable. Or at least you hope that they're going to be. And you've gone through the work of setting this simple subtraction up, so that it's a reasonable thing to do. And so here you're just subtracting the emissions for a single unit from the status quo or the incumbent technology or stack of technologies. You're subtracting the innovation emissions from that larger number. It's at the surface very simple. It should be, and most of the work is before this. If you put in the work to come up with good numbers to support each of those things, and the work to ensure that these things are comparable, then you've done most of the work. And from here, and this is where a tool like Crane can really pick things up and run with it. You get all kinds of analytics. All kinds of ways of looking and slicing and dicing, but it's all based on those prior steps.
Seth, just a quick question here.
Yep.
I've heard you make reference a few times to LCA data, and LCA databases as a way to estimate the per unit emissions. Can you talk a little bit about how the work that Project Frame is doing both builds off of and advances standard LCA practices that have been in the market for a bit longer? Yeah,
certainly. So LCA is great. It's been around for, I think, 30 years now, and has been evolving at a crazy clip, even in the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years. It's so good at formalizing essentially formalizing the math behind getting a footprint, the embodied energy or the embodied emissions or the embodied water, whatever you want to look at, whatever the other impacts are for complex interconnected systems. It's great at that. It's not so great at looking at dynamic, forward-looking emissions, especially when you have stacks of poorly defined technologies, or more abstracted technologies, or vaguer technologies that are likely to exist in the future. So we've seen, especially for product declarations and these kinds of things, you can go through the work, and sometimes sometimes it's required. Other times it's just the best way of doing the comparison. It gives you a good snapshot, a hyper precise snapshot, ex post of what your just replacing one unit of one incumbent would look like versus with your innovation. There are so many other elements to bring into this, especially when you want to look at how emissions from a particular set of technologies are expected to change over time. That's where data from the IEA and some of the others we referenced earlier kind of come in, where they're looking at projections. But those will be they'll consider emissions that are coming from many more sources or individual like units than an individual LCA. So they're all part and parcel of a similar kind of thinking. It's all a question of where the emissions are occurring and when. It's just given the uncertainty and so many of the other variables that you may be bringing in, say like market penetration assumptions or any of these other things, it can be an informative tool, but an insufficient tool to doing forward-looking impact. So yeah. Okay, so calculating unit impact here, just really briefly on this, so we can get over to a case study, which I'll be thrilled to describe. Now we have many of these. So the unit impact here, you can see where the emissions occurred. Negative impact at the production. This is comparing, for instance, an electric vehicle to a similar ICE vehicle. And then end of life, where you're recycling the batteries or you're doing these other things, is like more energy. But across the lifetime of the vehicle, year to year, mile per mile, kilometer, that happy passenger trip to happy passenger trip, you're finding a gain, and that is the unit impact. And then finally, on the next slide, with respect to commercial volumes, you've characterized what it will mean for an individual unit of either sale or what have you, or functional units as you've defined them. You've characterized all that. Now it's a question for an individual company or perhaps a technology at large. And that's the distinction I would make between planned versus potential. Planned impact would be for an individual company based on its business plan and prospects. You can sell X number of EVs or X number of motors over a certain period of time. Potential would be for a technology at the technology level, multiple actors. It's the very top. So it could be an individual company that like rarely happens. That would be a monopoly. Potential we describe as what's the absolute maximum based on what emissions we're expecting to make in the absence of that technology. There's plenty more on that in the project frame resources. And so that's this final kind of piece, is saying, how quickly is it going to be picked up in the market? What other factors should you bring in? And it's ultimately just multiplication. It's per unit impact times the number of units over the course of years, and that's what gives you the numbers. So if we want to quickly skip ahead to the next, and then of course you want to report these things and then update those reports, but that'll be kind of outside of the bounds of this discussion. So this isn't all theoretical. It was a few years ago, but this is very much being used by a variety of different investor types, ones that are impact labeled and others that are not. We've been thrilled to see the ways that people have been expanding on, kind of riffing on, improving, thinking about, and customizing the ERP approach to better fit their own investments and their own theses. One that I'm going to pick on a little bit, just because we helped put it together, was a report that Eclipse put out last year. We do have the links in the presentation here, and we can make sure to get these others. They're all excellent reports. There is one of the companies that Eclipse had invested in called Arc Boats. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. This is a little it's still an EV, but it's an interesting one that I like to talk about. So they had invested in Arc Boats, and we were doing a retrospective analysis for them, both in terms of what impact had occurred, as well as what impact they expect to have by a certain date, and assuming a certain number of a certain degree of market penetration in the U.S. So these are the high level takeaways. They make electric recreational boats. They've had their first purpose built maritime design. It's a pretty big battery. The boats exist. You can see them. There's even a fleet of them now. I don't know how big the fleet is, but it's been pretty cool to see. And it's wouldn't be the first thing, but this is, and it's the emissions for recreational boating. The total market for that is pretty small relative to just getting people from point A to point B over land or moving goods. But it is I would argue ripe for disruption, because these kind of maritime motors are so inefficient. They generate at the point of use per mile you go. Anybody who's ever been on one of these kind of boats, an ice-based boat, internal combustion, a traditional boat, anybody who's ever gone water skiing knows when they're being blasted in the face with gas fumes and oil fumes, how inefficient these boats are. And so that's where Arc Boats has kind of come in. So we did this analysis primarily using Crane, and then including the background calculations and the set of data transformations, finding out what we could get from the EIA's outlooks on recreational boating, and what the numbers for that would be. So we went through that process to come up with these numbers. But you can quickly and pretty easily apply, at least in this case, the project frame orientation to this, and just start to answer the questions for, say, an individual year, make it a little bit more tangible. And so just the only thing I would take note of there, actually two things, if you go to the next slide. One is million metric ton CO2. You'll see that one. I can't help but say this since I'm a scientist. Please pay attention to the units on the GHG emissions. It's so easy to make mistakes in this. And we have our forebears to thank for the confusion around what M means. So in Crane, I'll just tell you that MMT CO2, not an SI unit, that would be MT, means million metric tons, synonymous with megatons. Just a PSA on that. But the other number I would draw your attention to is at the bottom. It says 27 megatons annually by 2040, based on the assumptions that we've laid out. Efficiency improvement per boat hour, or billion boat hours, is our actual functional unit, and then assuming a certain degree of market penetration. So let's quickly look at the a table. So if you go to the next slide. So we got all of our steps laid out here. Let's just think about this for an individual year. We're projecting to 2040 on this, so you could do it easily for 2030. How is ARC better than the alternative? If you're charging these boats up with grid power, or you're buying either cleaner grid power or straight up from a renewable resource, they're going to be better than ice boats. That's a pretty straightforward one. It's a little cherry picked, so I admit that, but it is possible to articulate this even in some of the more nebulous cases, and you're going to want to do that. What are the units? Ones that the EIA provides are are boat hours. Just because of the scaling, it makes sense to talk about these things in terms of billion boat hours. We've got our I, which is billion electric boat hours, and our S, which is billion ice boat hours. You could have defined units in terms of number of boats sold if you wanted to. Ultimately, this is going to have to be reducible to an amount of emissions. So electric boat hours, I like to, in some cases, cut straight to this, because I know it's going to be an intermediate variable, or an intermediate unit of measure, I should say, regardless. And it makes the math a little bit, ends up making the math a little bit cleaner. So electric boat hours, or boat hours, is really what we're looking at. Emissions per unit. The 121 for the SC, that's the status quo. That's coming from EIA numbers. And then we have a % reduction based on additional math and research that Arc Boats had done in partnership with some other firms. So there's a pretty big reduction in terms of the number of fun boating hours that you get out of these things. And then our unit impact is 109. So finally, from a commercial standpoint, the 8.7% market penetration by 2040 in the US equates to 0.25 billion boat hours. And you can just multiply that savings per unit savings by 0.25, and voila, you have your impact for that year. Of course, this goes across years, and that's part of the thing that Crane is pretty good at looking at. They published their report. They cited the assumptions as many of their peers had done, and they'll probably publish a report later this year. So this is all well in line. Okay, I think that is it from my side. Shall we move on?
Yeah, this has been super useful. I see a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so maybe we can spend a few minutes on that. The latest one that just popped up in my chat is one around impact attribution and how to treat operational versus financial control. as defined by the GHG protocol. So how would you distinguish between the GHG emissions and the financial and operational control and sort of the enabled impact that might have lack of direct operational control, or might be more, again, looking at kind of the potential impact?
That's a really great question. So in terms of operational control, that can be a little that can be clearer for sure. When you say, I mean, it's just stated in the name in terms of the degree of the degree of impact that you're going to claim or want to claim. Likewise, with the financial sort of investment element, there are some pretty straightforward ways of doing that. Percent of total investment, or percent of control of the company, that reduces it to more arithmetic. It gets dicier when you're starting to look at questions around the timing and scale of investment, and where technology is expected to be in its own kind of learning curve and cost reductions. That's several steps ahead. I would argue, but I look to Keri and Claudia as well to you all to answer this. That's a few steps ahead of where we see kind of market standard. What folks are generally doing, including investors and everything, it's just like they're just trying to get a sense of the overall system. Double counting is an issue sometimes when it's reducible to what you're claiming and what your audiences are for what you're claiming and why. That can vary whether you're going to reduce the total impact that that you want to claim or can claim. But anyway, that's just taking a really quick step back. The key thing, at least at present, for the foreseeable future, I would say near term, is what's the cogent representation of the system, so that everybody who is making an argument about where the impacts are occurring and who's responsible for those impacts, so that when they're making those arguments, they can all be on the same page. That's kind of where I would argue that's kind of where we are. It's a little bit of a squirrely answer, but that's been my sense.
And I would just add, I'd like to do a plug for future frame materials. We are actually going to be releasing a short paper on the topic of attribution in the next couple months, and we've been discussing this amongst a subset of the project frame community. Some of those who even have reports that Seth shared, as well as a larger focus group. If you're interested in being involved in that conversation, I'll put my information in the chat. We would love to have more voices on these topics.
Great. Well, there is also just a question around whether you've seen any approaches for the real estate and construction space. And I think more broadly, if you could speak to like any sector specific approaches that you've seen develop either among the project frame community or outside of it.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I'm not an expert in the real estate and construction space. Given those, I will say that those sectors, from everything I've seen, there are tools, there's guidance, and coalitions out there that are, I would say, pretty advanced in terms of the analytics. Just looking at real estate in terms of the operational, say, energy use, there are tons of metrics out there, and those as we continue transition in the fully kind of measured and metric based world, buildings are a great place to do that, and they're everything from software that's enabling the transition into finding and finding the efficiencies, both in terms of retrofits and all that. And there are standards that are out there, like boards that say, of buildings of this type, this is what you should be looking at for energy, and this type and age, this is what you should be looking at in terms of efficiency. Likewise, in construction, when you're thinking about best practices and materials to use and questions around that, there are resources out there, and I can follow up because we have a library of a few of these. Be happy to share those. We're in a position, since we're generalists, coming into this and looking at this from the innovation lens, of always learning from the sectors. It's almost always the case that the sectors themselves will have some really sharp views on how to think about forward-looking emissions, LCAs, and all of that, and guidance. And so in that respect, we're kind of catching up, but it can be a really great kind of meeting of the minds when we're saying, here's the best practices if you're a site manager or the person who's running the construction project in total and trying to get the potential or likely environmental footprint, and then feeding that to investors through these kind of conversations.
Great. Thanks, Seth. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks to everyone who's joined today and has asked questions. I guess as a bit of a closing remark, I'd like to ask both of you if you could just give us a preview or say one thing that you're excited about that's coming for either one of your organizations or that you see as the next exciting development in this space. That would be great. Oh, Keri.
Keri, you're muted.
Almost made it through the whole presentation. Thank you so much, Claudia, Tideline, Seth, everyone for being here today. This was a really great discussion and hopefully just the beginning. I'm most excited about the work that Frame is going to be doing in the coming months on some of the topics that were mentioned in the chat. So I think a few of you are experts, not really new to this area, but we're going to get into these more complicated areas of attribution, relative versus absolute baselines. And a colleague of mine, Dan Ferger, mentioned in the Q&A sort of how we can do net zero alignment for portfolios. And one thing I would just challenge everyone on the call to do is, even though there is science behind this, it's also an art. I think the first step is that we really need to be more ambitious in the climate investments that we're making in order to meet the really real threat that we're facing. And so I just encourage all of you to go back to your teams and say, how can we be better yesterday? And what can we invest in tomorrow that's really going to make a difference? And reach out and sign up for Frame. Happy to talk with you further.
Echoing all of that, sign up for Crane as well. It's free. I think the link is in there. More users on that. I'm really excited about improvements. We're planning to make in Crane this year, and just on a go forward basis. It's been thrilling to see the number of users grow every week, every day almost. But I'm also as a sort of seasoned and occasionally frustrated user of the tool, well aware that we have miles to go before we sleep on making it really sing. So we love all kind of constructive criticism, or just criticism. Feel free to send it our way because we're going to improve the tool, and it's a shared resource. The other area, I think to Dan, the point, Keri, that you were making about net zero pathway alignment, 100% on that. We've had the pleasure of working alongside Tideline on various projects in the past, Rho Impact, that look at pathway alignment and consider what investment, like what does it mean for an investment to be pathway aligned? Like, what does that really mean? And how do we put it into practice? And then what does implementation look like? And then what does verification of impacts in the future look like? And all of that, and I think it's so essential. So I just want to echo that. And I'm just, I'm excited for the conversations in the future and to learn from the community here based on everyone's experience. So that's what I'm excited about for 2023.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again to everyone who joined today on this conversation, and looking forward to hosting many more current series.
Thanks so much.
Have a good one.
Have a good one.